In the late 1970s, a group of us who were men got together in the San Francisco Bay Area to talk about our lives and relationships and what worked and what didn't work. And what we realized in those discussions was that a lot of what didn't work in our lives had to do with how we were raised to be men. Not surprising, but it was surprising to us. At the same time, many of us knew women in the women's movement, particularly the parts of the women's movement that was dealing with issues of male violence, the battered women's movement, sexual assault movement, child sexual assault movement. And we went to some of the women. We decided we wanted to do something as men to make a difference. So we went to some of the women that we knew, and we said, what can we do? You know, we want to help. Well, they said, we have our hands full working with the survivors of male violence, but it's men who are doing the violence, and you're men. Talk to the men. And our response was, well, is there anything else we could do? How about some child care? How about some filing? Anything but talk to the men. Because for one reason, they were the bad guys, right? And we were the good guys. And we wanted to make sure there was a big difference between us and them. Right? And then, of course, once we started talking to them, it got much more confusing. It got much harder to tell who was the bad guys and who were the good guys, because we looked a lot like them and they looked a lot like us. But the women were real clear. They were, you know, we need men to talk to men. And that was one of my first lessons in what it meant to be an ally, which is that I don't get to just waltz into the room and decide what I want to do or what I think needs to be done, but I need to listen to those who are on the front lines of the struggle and do what needs to be done. So when women said this to us, they were saying it around the country to many different groups, and there were two different ways that that was heard. And I think this was really an important milestone in some ways, because most men in the country who were concerned about male violence heard talk to the men as set up batterers programs, work with men who are violent. For the group of us in the Bay Area, though, we realized that that wasn't going to be enough or sufficient or adequate, and that if we got caught up in doing counseling, that would overwhelm our ability to do any kind of prevention or community work around the issues of male violence. So in 1979, we put together a little workshop, started going out to men's groups, going into junior and senior high schools, talking about male-female relationships and violence. We started a group called the Oakland Men's Project that was around for about 20 years to do community education and prevention on issues of male violence. One of the things that happened, though, is that we started going into the schools, Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose, around the Bay Area, multiracial, multi-class, very diverse schools, and talking about male-female roles. Well, the young people were very clear with us. They said, yes, there's some violence in our relationships. Yes, there's some violence in our families. But if you're serious about dealing with violence, then it's not just the gender-based violence. It's the fights on the playground. It's the gangs. It's the police brutality in our neighborhoods. That it's the gay bashing. It's a range of interpersonal issues of violence. And, they said, it's not just the interpersonal violence, but look at the state of the schools we're in. Look at the lack of jobs in our community. Look at the toxic dumping in our communities. If you're serious about working with us to stop the violence, then it's a range of issues and it's a number of levels of violence that we have to be looking at. Well, we rushed back to the drawing boards and really had to rethink in a fundamental way, what does it mean to be doing violence prevention work? And we still use the words male violence because any of those levels of violence have to do with men being violent, whether we look at domestically or overseas or institutionally or interpersonally. Primarily, that's men doing violence. So we kept the male violence focus, but violence became very broad. So I want to start out by just making very clear what we're talking about, because often this conversation about violence gets unclear very quickly. And I want to just separate out three different things. One is prejudice and stereotypes. And for us, that's not what we're talking about. In this society, in either New Zealand or in the States, everybody, because of the miseducation we get in schools and the media distortions, we all have a lot of prejudices. And part of our responsibility as mature adults is just to unlearn those, you know, to deal with those. But if I can take my prejudice and I have some personal or social power over somebody else, as a teacher, as a co-worker, as an apartment owner, storekeeper, neighbor, whatever, then I can act out an interpersonal act of sexism. I can discriminate against somebody, I can abuse somebody, I can exclude somebody. And this is often what we're looking at when we talk about violence, is the discrete interpersonal acts. But beyond that, we have whole systems and institutions in place that are based upon male violence, so that the criminal justice system and the political system and the economic system are set up to benefit men in general and to exploit and abuse women and make them vulnerable to abuse. And if we think about family violence, what keeps women in relationships? Well, certainly it's the physical fear, but it's also a lot of the institutional sexism, the fact that women don't make as much and don't have economic options, that they don't have housing options, that there's not childcare available. There's a lot of real institutional reasons why it's difficult for women to leave situations of family violence that are not just about the interpersonal stuff. So this is part of the context that I want to look at today in thinking about male violence and the role of men in that. And one of the things that I've found has been very useful is to look at two questions, which I've written up here. The first question is, what do you stand for? And it's a question we've traditionally asked ourselves and asked young people. Are you a person of integrity, of respect, of honesty, of trust? Do you stand for good moral qualities? And that's a very important question that we have to ask ourselves. But this question is also very important. The second question, who do you stand with? When women first came to us and said, there's a lot of male violence, men are battering women and men are sexually assaulting women, my first response was, whoa, I'm innocent. You know, I treat women respectfully. I don't hit my partner. I'm a good person. But then they said, but there's 4 or 5 million men a year in the United States that batter their partners. Do you stand with us in the struggle to end male violence? And that was a harder question to answer. Similarly, when I was involved with civil rights work and African Americans were coming to me and talking about, you know, racism and police brutality, and my first response was, well, I treat everybody equally. I'm a good person. I'm colorblind. But they said, what about racism in the school system and in the criminal justice system, and et cetera? And I had to ask that same question, who do I stand with? Do I stand with people of color in the fight for racial justice? So this is the question that our work is really focused around and challenging men. Because very often, we're so relieved that that a man just stops hitting his partner or his kids or whatever, that's all we accept. That's all we expect. We don't say, how do we get men involved in the struggle to end male violence? Because we know we could spend years and years and years, thousands of years, running batterers programs or working with individual men, but that's not going to make a difference in ending male violence. And so this is the question we have to be asking. How do we get men to stand with us in the struggle for gender equity, for the end of male violence?